Welcome everybody who is joining the next Sustainable Herbs Program webinar. It's great to have you here. And as you're entering, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. You can let us know where you're joining, and if you're working in somehow in the herbal products value network, if you can just mention what your role is, so we have a sense of who's in the audience. As you know, we're here. I'm going to be speaking with Laura Dunteman and Robbe Verhofste. I hope, Robbe, I pronounced your name correctly, about their work on participatory knowledge systems. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It came about when I was speaking with Lauren and Robbe about the challenges of certifications and the burden often that those place on suppliers. And so I've been really interested in the work that they're doing to be more collaborative in meeting the standards and respecting and honoring all of the stakeholders. And sorry about that. Trying to move. As always, these webinars are made available for free through the generous support of Sustainable Herbs Program underwriters and members. You can find out more who these are on our website, and also through membership in American Botanical Council. And you can find out more information on how to join and on the resources that American Botanical Council has at herbalgram.org. And these webinars I've been having for the last 2 or 3 years, and we're kind of coming to a close. There'll be one more that I'm having next month with Elisa Aragon from Nalixia in Guatemala. She works with primary processors. And all of these webinars can be viewed on the Sustainable Herbs Program website. And my intention in having these has really been to bring in new voices, different voices often that aren't part of the mainstream conversation in the herbal products industry, so that we have more voices, more ideas, more perspectives to think about how to address the challenges. And all of that is available on the SHP Sustainable Herbs Program website. But for now, I want to turn it to the conversation with Lauren and Robbe. And so Lauren Dunteman is a senior associate at Terra Genesis. She designs regenerative sourcing initiatives that enhance collaboration among brands, farmers, processors, and the environment. Using her graduate degree in sustainable food systems, she explores the intricate connections between agriculture, culture, markets, and the environment. Drawing upon her upbringing on a farm, Lauren designs, implements, and quantifies the impact of regenerative programs with farmers and brands in food and fashion sectors. Her work aids businesses of all sizes, from small enterprises to Fortune 500 companies, to achieve corporate objectives while prioritizing the aspirations and leadership of the farming communities. Lauren also leads a coalition of farmers in our local community to make agriculture a more joyful, equitable, and dignified career path for current and future generations. So welcome, Lauren. And then Robbe. Robbe's the son of Belgian farming immigrants. He spent most of his childhood on a mixed corn, soy, and livestock farm south of Des Moines, Iowa. For years, Robbe toiled between focusing his life energy on botanical medicine as a means to support humanity's relationship with the earth, versus working directly on ecological science and agriculture. In this process, he explored a middle ground, studying and working with farmers in the US and working on biological and environmental research in Belgium, Iowa, and Costa Rica. Robbe's master's program in ecological design at the Conway School later deepened his relationship to agricultural planning across varying scales. Now with Terra Genesis for 5 years, Robbe is greatly energized by ongoing opportunities to learn and connect with farmers. Through these relationships, he's found that shifting consciousness and perspective of actors within supply systems serves as a fundamental step in activating the potential of farmers. When not grappling with wicked challenges at Terra Genesis, Robbe can be found in the San Francisco Bay Area, foraging, hosting workshops and gatherings, or reading about the efficacy of the latest herb that has caught his attention. So I wanted to read all of those because I think your background is really interesting and you bring deep connection with the soil and the earth and the plants as well as the people. So maybe to start off, I'd love to hear you define what is what is regeneration for you all, and can you relate that to the work at Terra Genesis that you're doing? Either one of you can start.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, for having us and everyone for joining. It's great to see your introductions in the chat. I hope we have a chance to connect in the future. I can start us, and Robbie, please jump in. Just to start to state that regeneration is a term in the industry that is often contended in terms of what does it mean? How is it defined? And in our work at Terra Genesis, we often kind of push back against this definition by creating a unique definition for all of the different contexts that we're working in. That being said, there are some principles of regeneration that I think are really useful to speak to. One is that regeneration is both a paradigm of work, which we'll speak to a little bit later, and an ongoing process. In the process end of things, what we mean by that is that there's not like an end state or a threshold where you cross and suddenly something's regenerative and you can stop trying. A regeneration is evolution. Living systems evolve, and being in a regenerative relationship with the land and communities means that projects are allowed to evolve so that they continue to fit the circumstances of that living system over time. And here, when we think about regeneration, we oftentimes think about a variety of core principles, which you'll hear Robbie and I speak to for the remainder of this session. Some of which to name now are that we take a living systems approach. We're looking at the whole system. And we really feel that regeneration has to look at whole systems in order to not be fragmented in like an approach of just trying to take a scattershot, do good approach. Another thing that's really useful for us when we think about regeneration is really having it be sourced from the place and the people that are involved in a particular project. So what regeneration looks like in one community is going to look a lot different than what it looks like in a different community. And so as a result, regeneration is uplifting the potential of communities and ecosystems to evolve uniquely based on their current circumstances.
Yeah, I might add a few points there. I think you touched on the majority there, Lauren. And also thank you for having us here today, Anne. It's a real pleasure, and want to recognize the many kind of sources and lineages that inform our work, including the Carol Sanford Institute, the Regenesis Institute, the hundreds of farmers that have influenced Terra Genesis over the years, and that we are a learning organization, and we're interested in learning with the participants here today and with the wider industry that is really rapidly evolving. Particularly around this question, what is regeneration? A few other principles are the premise and principle of nestedness, that like a liver within a body, within a community or family, or an ecosystem within a bioregion, living systems are nested. And when we work towards seeing that nestedness, we can activate greater levels of potential and impact. And that social communities are and can be considered living systems that undergo many of the same processes of what we would conventionally consider nature as objects out there, as opposed to within ourselves. And then lastly, this concept of nodal intervention points. So in the same way that if you prick a acupuncture needle in one part of your body, it might relieve a headache somewhere very different in your body. There are these nodal points within a system that are very different from kind of a more mechanical approach to scaling, to addressing all points simultaneously. And so that's a principle of potentially human health and herbalism, but that we apply and really are continuously curious about when we're working with communities.
And as Anne mentioned, Robbie and I currently work with Terra Genesis. So I thought it could be useful for us to speak a little bit more to who Terra Genesis is and what we do. We're a regenerative design firm. Oftentimes people think of the role that we hold in the industry as consultants, but we really enjoy stepping into the role of being co-conveners and co-designers, project implementation partners. And this work takes place at the intersection between ecology, economy, and culture, where we're working between brands and farmers to help uplift regenerative agriculture in order to meet the needs of various different stakeholders at once. So sometimes Terra Genesis works primarily with a brand to help them meet corporate sourcing commitments. And importantly, those projects also are really, really integrated in building relationships with producers on the ground, where we're understanding from them what regeneration means there and incorporating that into the programming that we're designing with them, so that as farmers' needs are continuing to be met through evolved sourcing relationships and improved transparency and relationship to the marketplaces that they're selling to, brands are better able to meet these important environmental and social goals that they've committed to. We work in the food system and then also other industries like apparel, just really in that relationship development and program design aspect between farmers and the brands that they are selling to.
Great, thanks for those framing comments. And I want to get into some of the details, like especially that nodal intervention and nestedness and what that really means. But before going there, I wondered if you all could provide some context. So there's this big focus on regeneration in part because of what? Like what's the context and why is this focus on living systems so important and something different than business as usual?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. And kind of zooming back in time to some of the earlier perceptions of the world as a mechanical entity. This kind of sources from Descartes, where the philosophy was introduced that the universe was created by God like a clock, and then God receded into the distance and was rarely to be seen again, but is comprised of these replaceable parts. And that led to some massive innovations in physics and Western knowledge. But we're now seeing some of the limits of seeing the world in a mechanical way. And in terms of the kind of colonial history of extraction and seeing commodities as mechanical entities that can be replaceable, that this banana is exactly the same as this banana, and the community that it comes from is replaceable if that relationship falls to the wayside. And so, over the last really 400 years of colonial actions from the British Empire and the Spanish Empire, the American Empire, we've seen a massive reduction in the diversification and the diversity of products that are available, to the detriment of human health and ecological health. And then that was further accelerated in the Green Revolution, where now systems that were much more brittle with monocultures of species became more and more dependent on external inputs, whether those were machinery based or synthetic inputs or external technical service providing from global north academic institutions. And really in the last 50 to 60 years has there been this movement to people waking up and seeing the harms and challenges that exist now within our global agricultural system, and this movement toward trying to reduce harm, moving from a place of extraction to harm reduction. And that led to the birth of many certification systems who intended to bring about kind of a revolution of agriculture. But with global regulation of those systems and kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, we've seen time and time again with smallholder farmers in cacao farmers in Ecuador, or coffee farmers in Colombia, or rubber farmers in Thailand, or ranchers in the United States, that these kind of very rigid processes of certification are not able to represent the complexity that could exist, or that recognize the knowledge of farmers on the ground. And so, yeah, I think we're now as a global system grappling with the potential that agriculture could bring about in the world. And I think that I appreciate this conversation as an opportunity to begin exploring what kind of world we want to bring about, and what are the tools and instruments, what is the right working of a certification system, of data on farms and of community engagement to bring that about.
Thank you. Lauren, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm okay for now. I think Robbie touched on everything. Thanks.
Yeah, that was great. Okay, so within that, how is your working with traditional knowledge systems, traditional practices, local farming communities? I don't know how you want to go about talking about that. It might be helpful to describe a project or something to make it's kind of abstract, to make it kind of concrete and tangible.
Yeah, thank you. I think bringing a story would be very grounding. We're working with rubber farmers in Thailand, and in the 80s there was this premise, kind of a Darwinian premise, that anything growing within a commodity garden would outcompete or reduce the yields of the key crop. And so there's a governmental approach to eliminating complexity of rubber gardens. One of the rubber farmers that we work with, Chatip, her father was a rubber garden and was forced to reduce the complexity and basically eliminate any secondary crops. And to make ends meet, she would go forage in the woods for medicinal herbs and other products that they would use at home to reduce their dependency and costs in the market, but also to sell those herbs. And over time, she started planting those plants within her father's rubber garden. Occasionally, authorities would come in and rip those out, and she would keep planting and planting. And then now, with the passing of her father and inheriting that land, she's dedicated really her life to building up as much complexity in her garden as possible, with increased yields as a result, both of the rubber trees, which are able to retain moisture longer in the year, and the sometimes hundreds of species that are growing in her garden. And so this is kind of a key case study in the value of diversification and the value of collaboration across species, and then potentially across industries, as she's now teaching other farmers about the opportunities of diversification, and then potentially the market access opportunities that arise in selling rubber simultaneous with medicinal herbs that are growing in their gardens, with coffee and pineapple. Have kind of a host of species that are currently being cultivated. It's now kind of a hot spot in terms of ginger biodiversity, from yellow ginger, yolanga, fingerroot. There are many different essential oils being created for balms and massages. Farmers are growing turmeric for medicinal purposes in cuisine. And kind of on a daily basis as a tonic, there's this green medicine that farmers use, which is a combination of around 36 different herbs that the farmers produce. And so kind of went deep into the medicinal space there, but figured this audience may be interested to hear the synergies that might not be obvious. What do tires have to do with herbal medicine? And there's maybe a lot more than what might meet the eye at the outset.
So I want to stay with that, and what's Terra Genesis's role in that, and how would you contrast that with when you said at the beginning, more scattershot approach, Lauren, like to do good? Can you like unpack a little bit the steps of what that participatory work actually looks like?
Yeah. So this transition that Robbie's speaking to is evolution through different paradigms of agriculture. And this is where I mentioned earlier that regeneration is a paradigm. This transition Robbie's speaking to is moving from a very extractive monoculture, where the only relationship that one has with the land is to maximize yields for export. And oftentimes we see in the sustainable agriculture industry this desire to reduce harm by reducing chemical usage or planting cover crops, obtaining the organic certification, or having external perspective on how harms have been reduced. But with the story that Robbie's sharing, these farmers have such a strong relationship with the land where they're not trying to reduce harm to the ecosystem. They're trying to have a really deep and meaningful relationship with it, where there's reciprocity between them and the land. And so we see these paradigms of agriculture where the farmers are becoming more regenerative in the way that they relate to the land through agriculture. But I want to take a step back to talk about the importance of viewing regeneration as a paradigm that can apply to everything, not just agriculture. There could be an instance where these farmers are practicing regeneratively, but they're being sourced from in an extractive way. So the paradigm of regeneration has to also apply to the way that relationships are developed and systems are engaged with. And so one of the roles that Terra Genesis plays is as in the relationship development space between the farmers and the rest of the system that they're a part of, and continuing to uplift the perspectives that the producers have. And in this reflection I'm having here about like taking a step back to think a little bit bigger picture of what regeneration means as a paradigm, I have a resource I can drop in the chat for people to take a look at. It was really meaningful to me when I was in graduate school, that just talks about like paradigms of community engagement and what it means to really engage with a community in an intentional way. Oftentimes programs completely forget about communities, and an organization is seeking the best product but forgetting about the people behind the scenes. We see some intention in the industry now of like getting producer input, saying, hey, here's our idea, what do you think? And this resource that I'll put in the chat is Paradigms of Community Engagement by Rosa Gonzalez. And I found it really helpful as a way to really challenge what it means to engage with communities. We can inform communities about the work that we're doing or help create opportunities for them to inform the work that we do. And when I say we, I'm generally referencing like CPGs, organizations in the food industry, the global north. If you're listening to this and you don't identify with those identities, I'd be interested to hear how your perspective resonates or it differs from what I'm sharing here as someone possibly from the global south or from a different part of the industry, such as a producer. But the reason that this resource has been so meaningful to me is that it helps to really encourage what it means to put producer perspectives at the center, so that instead of just consulting with them on occasion to say, hey, here's our here's our idea, what do you think? Is really how this project look like to provide you with the kind of experience. What was that?
Oh, you paused there.
Robbe, you cut out there for a second. Oh, okay. Sorry, my internet might be a little unstable. Centering producers so that they're actually the ones who are collaborating with the brands to say, this is what regeneration looks like here. This is what we're excited about and what we need. And by deferring to communities to really be center in conversations, we get to uplift their expertise. So as an example, in this regenerative rubber project in Thailand that Robbe was speaking to, we've placed producers at the center of program design and data collection, where they're able to teach us what regeneration means there by identifying really unique social and environmental indicators that they see evolve over time based on their involvement in the program. And these producers have pointed out indicators to us that have been really, really insightful that academic literature published from a third party in a different country might not have identified as useful to keep an eye on. But through this data collection process that we're doing, where we're really centering the producer's wisdom of how their systems evolve, we've learned a lot from them. And then another thing that's been important in this process is designing systems where the farmers are learning from one another. So this participatory guarantee system, or the participatory knowledge sharing, invites in a paradigm where the producers are the experts. They have a lot of really, really meaningful perspectives about how to be in relationship with the land and improve the health and quality of their crops and the nutrition of what they're harvesting. And being able to have producers learn from one another instead of just relying on like an academic service provider or an external advisor on agriculture from a different place. These producers are really enriching the cultural knowledge that they have in their place. And so that's another role that Terra Genesis plays, is really uplifting that paradigm of the way in which we engage with communities and centering their perspectives in the work that we do.
That's great. Actually, one of the things I've been just beginning at Sustainable Herbs program is this producer to producer collaboration. It's all virtual, but to share that knowledge horizontally about quality standards or best practices to empower them, so it's not just coming from the brands and their brands' expectations or the certifications and the certifications expectations.
Yeah, it was just on the line this week with some ranchers in the United States who were expressing kind of frustration and doubt around data collection processes, because they're revealing personal data around their farms, whether it's through certifications or other data collection mechanisms, and then that value is captured externally to their farms. And what they specifically noted was, if I could see my farm neighbor and they're reaching these outcomes on a biodiversity level or a yield level or quality of their product, I want to know that, so that I can then learn from that farmer. And so then we start to put data collection on its head. Who is the data collection for ultimately? Is it for the solely the end consumer of that product, but can it be generating value to each stakeholder along that process? And then also, how do we ensure that the privacy and integrity of that data is maintained through that supply, so that farmers have ultimately a right and a say around how that data is distributed? And so with the case study that Lauren's bringing here, this is really highlighting the Ethos protocol, the Ethos Regenerative Outcome Verification System, which is fundamentally designed to facilitate place-sourced regeneration, identify what regeneration looks like in a place, support farmers in collecting data on their own farms, but then also employing them with data sovereignty, so they have the right to sell anonymized data from their farms or redact that information. And in that way, there retains very high fidelity and trust of the farmers in participating. There's an eagerness, and they have the opportunity to utilize that data in order to see what's happening on other farms in their region, in order to manage their cooperatives, in order to track their secondary yields of products that mentioned at the beginning of this call. So I'll pause there.
Can you give some examples of the kind of data, or Lauren, back to your point about that it's different than what an outsider might identify? Or
yeah, a really valuable example of that in this Thai origin is when we asked the producers, how do you know that your systems are regenerating? They said that they look for the mushrooms in their forest, which is typically not mentioned as regularly in scientific literature about regeneration, but it's been one of the indicators that is actually correlated most strongly with satellite imagery of these forests or these plots being reforested and diversified over time. And what's cool is not only are the mushrooms like a visual indicator that the soil is becoming richer and the forests are having a cooler microclimate and higher humidity, which is useful for the health of the micro ecosystem and the presence of the mushrooms. But these farmers then are also able to exchange knowledge with one another on what to do with the mushrooms and what the presence of those mushrooms mean. And so not only is it a visual indicator that the systems are evolving, but it's correlated to additional knowledge sharing, which has been really valuable for producers to say, these particular mushrooms can be incorporated into our cuisine, and these particular ones show up at this time of the annual cycle based on certain environmental conditions. And what's valuable is that we've been able to correlate it to additional data points that are like secondary and tertiary data points, satellite imagery being one of them. So there's this process we have where we're really centering the producer's experience of collecting primary data on the ground and then finding relationships between that data and the photos that they're sharing with us with other additional data points, so that we have a whole systems perspective of what's taking place there.
Another on the kind of social side that might contribute is the example that Lauren's sharing is grounded in the philosophy of Wanakesate, which is a philosophy that originated in Thailand around self-reliance and community interdependence. And so that kind of forms the bedrock of regeneration in this context. Chatip is one of the leaders in Monica Sate philosophy in this context. And so one of their indicators that they've identified and is now kind of a requirement to participate is increasing knowledge of medicinal species, of species for structural uses in the home, for food, and in some cases, opportunities to learn about spiritual species that have spiritual significance. And that this knowledge kind of builds over time. And where that knowledge is not building, the cooperative supports those individuals to deepen their knowledge of they're observing new mushrooms coming in their gardens, but how can they actually use those in the garden, use those at home, as opposed to kind of just seeing them as an anomaly that arises as a result of the process of diversification. And also want to go back to a question that you brought, Anne, around how it is we work, and kind of disambiguating that a little bit, is we're either in direct relationship with producer communities and seeing a great amount of potential in a given context, or we're working with brand partners who need support within their supply system, and then we work directly with those producers. And across the board, monoculturalization is the norm, whether we're looking on any kind of corner of the planet. And oftentimes it's brands who are looking to us to redesign the cropping system. And what we do at that point is take a step back and really enter into a relationship with the community, try and identify the oddballs, who are the weirdos who have been practicing in a different way, who have begun the journey of wanting something beyond extractive agriculture akin to mining. And then how can we support those individuals and also develop a language within a community around what they would like to see, what would they be reaching for if the challenges of the supply system that they're a part of were eliminated, what could become possible. And in that process, developing a sense of will, a sense of kind of urgency and wanting to achieve more for one's garden, for one's family. And then a deep education process with our brand partners. How can we make that happen? Is it just buying, supporting the purchase of 1 million seedlings, or is it developing closer relationship with those communities and facilitating trust? And I think it's a combination of the two. But yeah, wanted to make that a little bit more explicit.
Yeah, that's great. Can you say a little bit more about the working with the brands part? I mean, you said it could be buying more seedlings or developing, like that process. Is it easy? Does it tend, what the challenges are? Is what you find is the most effective way of helping them bring about those changes within their companies?
Yeah, I can start to speak to this. It kind of goes back to one of the questions that was posed earlier about like how to take kind of a system level approach to creating these programs and working with producers. One of the brands that we work with is Oatly. They're an oat beverage company in North America and Sweden primarily. And when they came to us, they had made corporate commitments about reducing the impact of their product. They wanted to increase biodiversity and reduce carbon, but they didn't carbon per unit of product, but they didn't really know how to approach that, and had struggled historically with this kind of like scattershot approach where they found these really cool programs in the United States that they were investing in, which of course is valuable for a brand to be sponsoring projects, but they had a hard time getting those projects to actually incorporate into their sourcing systems because they weren't doing it with their supply shed. And a really important part of the work that we've done with them is building really deep relationships with their millers and the farmers that their millers are buying from, and designing the projects in relationship with those entities. So having weekly calls with a miller to say, okay, how are we going to promote biodiversity? What works for these farmers, and how would they be interested in monitoring changes in biodiversity is much different than a brand designing things on their own and saying, if you want to sell to us, you have to meet this criteria. And that's been really, really important for the brand, because what what was working in those like small pilot projects that they were funding in one part of the North America was not actually reasonable for the producer community that they're purchasing from in another part. And so that was a really important part of the process, is starting to have that like system level design process with various different stakeholders, including organizations that are helping them monitor changes on the ground and project the potential of the project over time with regard to biodiversity and carbon. And then another thing that was really important is just taking this approach of acknowledging that the goals were originally set for the entire company, but then the sustainability department was the one who was mandated to make this change happen. But without having a strong relationship with procurement, it's hard to have that kind of change. And so there's been a really strong relationship development internally within the organization of getting procurement and sustainability to be highly in sync in terms of meeting the supply resilience needs on the procurement side of things, while also having the impact that they're looking for in their sourcing system. And so you can hear in my reflections here that a lot of it is creating alignment across the different stakeholders with different needs. And for Oatly, what that looked like is starting at the big picture and coming up with that umbrella framework, where their first step was defining what regeneration meant to them, and then identifying what outcomes they wanted their regenerative sourcing to accomplish. And so that's where they're focusing on biodiversity, carbon, and farmer livelihoods. And once that framework was designed, then they could turn to their supply partners and say, how do we accomplish this together? And that gave them enough structure to be able to have that multi-stakeholder engagement process.
To stay with that example for a second, so, and what were some of the actual on the ground initiatives that arose from that, or is it still in the forming?
Yeah, it's still in development. What they're doing is they have a tiered approach where farmers enter at different tiers, and their Oatly's approach is to de-risk transition by providing financial incentives for the producers to transition. And so producers are able to receive support based on each additional practice that they add per acre that they're growing on. And there are different tiers of practices that farmers can engage in, so that Oatly is able to see internally, how are our farmers advancing amongst these tiers across our overall supply system. But on the producer side of things, it's made relatively simple for them, where they just know, okay, if reducing my synthetic inputs is important to me, I know that I'm going to be supported in making an effort to do that. And what's interesting about that approach is that Oatly's goals were designed around outcomes, but they're actually paying the farmers for practices. And that distinction is unique because it helps de-risk things for the producers. Of course, most of the reason brands are interested in regenerative agriculture is because they want to accomplish outcomes. They want to know that their impact is different than it was prior to these initiatives. But understanding how impacts evolve over time is still a new space in the industry. It's something that the industry is still grappling with in terms of understanding how to appropriately collect data and incentivize outcomes over time. And so by having the producers say, well, in this place that I live, I think the best way to improve my business, like resilience, is by adding another crop to my crop rotation. That's something I would like to choose to do. That also has impacts on soil health, etc. But having that farmer be able to elect into what practices work for them is the approach that they've taken.
Robbe, you want to add anything to that?
I think that was great. And yeah, I was just reading some of the questions coming in as well. So happy to maybe in the last like 10 or 15 dive into those.
Yeah, and if there are questions, please, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll have some time for that in the last 10 minutes. But it's just hard for me to sort through when they're in the chat. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the Ethos ROV, because it's still not really clear to me what exactly that is, and how it's different or what it's accomplishing.
Yeah, happy to dig in there. The Ethos Regenerative Outcome Verification is a protocol and a program wherein we collaborate with communities to identify what regeneration and what indicators of regeneration look like in a given context. And then using offline capable apps support farmers in collecting data on their own farms in a peer-to-peer fashion, as well as integrating secondary and tertiary data sources. So these include, in some cases, audio files and recordings from farms to assess bioacoustics. In some cases, partnership with local universities that are looking to answer some of those same questions and create another counterfactual for that system, or third-party remote sensing-based data. And what we engage with is a process of cross-validation. So when a farmer begins to integrate new crops, that begins to become an indication for soil health, but also potentially for the farmer livelihood if they're able to market those crops. And there are indices then that are measurable from space. And so rather than kind of having a single checkbox that this practice is met, is this within a constellation, kind of a whole system, a whole farm and whole systems-based approach leading to change. And then the data that's collected then is utilized at different levels in the supply system. So at the farm level, for farmers to track goals on their changes and improvements, for brands to be able to track their impact, and then eventually for consumers to be able to see the impact of a given product on the market. The kind of product-based claims is by far the trickiest element to address, and so we're in constant dialogue with our brand partners around what that could look like and how we would provide the most value there.
And something I'll add to this is that at its core, in addition to all of the principles that Robbe spoke to, is that Ethos is building transparency amongst producers and buyers. And one of the reasons I saw some questions in the chat about certifications. Certifications, of course, serve a really important role in the industry. Brands are facing a lot of consumer demand to have a label on a product that demonstrates that a certain threshold of like required practices has been met. But a lot of times certifications don't actually share data on what has happened. They guarantee that certain practices are or aren't used, but it's hard for brands to interpret that into understanding how they're meeting their corporate commitments from an outcomes perspective. And so what Ethos is doing is it's taking this data, which is being aggregated and anonymized for the producers, but the producers still own the data, which goes to that data sovereignty point that Robbe spoke to. And then in this process, when a brand buys a crop or an ingredient from the farmers, they can also buy license to the data. And so then they have very, very specific high fidelity data associated with the product that they're purchasing. And the brands are selling it as if it's an additional yield from their farm. This relationship development is valuable because another challenge that brands tend to see in the certification space is that each intermediary is building it into their margin, and certifications can be really expensive. That's not to say they don't have a role in the industry, but that's oftentimes prohibitive for brands to use. And by directly purchasing data from the farmers, there's no need for that intermediary markups throughout the value system. And the brands can have a more direct compensation to the producers as a way to thank them for the efforts that they've put in changing the impact of their sourcing system and then using data to validate the understanding of what that change is.
I'm curious what your all's thoughts are about scale. I recently read an interesting article about too much focus on scaling up and scaling out, and also this value of scaling deep. And just, there's a lot of crises in the world right now, and we do need to make change on a bigger scale. But I'm just curious how you think about it in your work.
Yeah, that's a awesome question. And we, in part, hold that the concept of scale in of itself is kind of a mechanical approach to replicating something from one place to another, from one community to another. And where we try to lean into is the opportunities to expand on programs, to extend them and evolve them, to see how they could change rather than having a perfect solution that is applicable everywhere. And in this case, this really involves the concept of nestedness. So how can we, and we're in the process of supporting individual farmers to join cooperatives, and now forming networks of cooperatives wherein there are delegates that are sent to higher levels to support in pricing negotiations, in determinations on how indicators and methodologies might change to assess what the needs are from a learning perspective. In one context we're working, there's a cooperative that is specialized in a native stingless bee cultivation. Another is growing cacao. This is also within the rubber context. Another is growing coffee, and others are growing pineapple and medicinal herbs. And so then scale kind of, as you're mentioning, goes deeper here, where we're able to then support and facilitate the process of farmers learning from one another and deepening their relationship to a higher diversity of herbs, and really increasing ultimately the yields in a multi-capital framework. So there's financial, there's intellectual yields, there are material yields, cultural yields. This is from the 8 forms of capital framework, which I'm happy to share after this call as well. And on the project development side, what we aim for, addressing a question in the chat, is to facilitate deeper relationships between the brand partners and the communities we're working. So wherever possible, we're supporting the process of brand partners to fly out and visit and eat in the gardens of farmers to see what a day in the life looks like. Maybe not directly in the harvest or planting, though we try to facilitate that. And most recently, farmers in the rubber context received or gifted a pair of Vans shoes. And the farmers were brought to tears because they've been exporting this latex their entire lives, have never seen the outputs, have never seen what that becomes. And so now there are a host of farmers who are wearing Vans and Timberland shoes and just like really stoked that it could have come from their actual trees.
I can get to the questions. I do want to give you all a chance to talk about what you've learned from this work and sort of what works well and where you're tweaking things.
Yeah, one thing I'll jump in here to speak to is that we just like really enjoyed embracing the approach of collaboration, and that takes place on multiple different levels. Some of the brands that we're working with acknowledge that if they're purchasing an annual crop, they need to have brands on board to buy other crops in the crop rotation, or it's not going to work for a producer to change all of their practices for year 1. And then years 2 through 5 in the crop rotation are back to 0 in terms of this transition. And there's a lot of momentum across the food and fashion industry to collaborate more and more. So we're also really excited about the opportunity to bring collaboration from the purchasing perspective into the Regenerative Rubber Alliance. Like Robbe mentioned, rubber was the keystone crop in this project. It was what really built a lot of initiative amongst the producers to convene across the whole watershed. But these producers are growing 40 other crops underneath the canopy of rubber trees. And if those crops are being grown in these same amazing systems, it feels like there's a really significant opportunity to extend that to the food industry. Banana, pineapple, cacao, coffee, and of course, all of the medicinal herbs that they're growing. And so there's an important conversation that needs to be taking place across the industry or across industries in terms of how do we do this together. There's, I think, a really special transition that I'm seeing happen where brands are a little less interested in competing in this space, or at least like their sustainability is not what they're trying to use to differentiate their product. They just view it as a really necessary part about supply resilience, climate adaptation, and then also having a really meaningful relationship with their suppliers. And to do that in partnership, reduce risks for all of the parties involved, and has multiplicative outcomes that are beneficial for all as well. So that's something I'm really excited about.
Robbe, do you want to add to that, or should we turn to the questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, I think another might be that as pointed to in some ways, that the kind of the knowledge and the insights are there if you create the space to to bring them to surface. So I'm asking a farmer, what did your grandparents grow, or what foods are really significant to this region, and can we start to explore what it might look like to begin introducing those, as opposed to strictly looking at the kind of the financial opportunities that could arise for a farmer. Because when farmers then are able to have higher degrees of food sovereignty and seed sovereignty and self-reliance in their systems, regardless of the place on Earth, all of these, additional benefits start to arise. And then also on the trust side, when facilitating the engagement between brand partners and communities, there's a higher level and potential for attenuation to market dynamics. So in one project, pricing was set and determined, and then the price decreased significantly, but the brand partner held steady through that time, which gave the community a level of trust that they had never experienced before. And then when the price, like the global market has seen so many turmoils over the last 2 years and will continue, and now the dynamic around pricing specifically is much more much more fluid, and kind of both parties are very open to collaborative approaches, as opposed to strictly not trusting the party because of history, and really the deep extractive history that global agriculture has created.
That's great, thank you. We don't have time for all the questions, but the first one, they asked if you could speak to your current views on the regenerative organic certifications for farms and or their herbal products. Is this at its infancy? What do these overlook, and what could be some areas of improvement consideration from a design view?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this. A really common question in the industry, and generally brands are grappling with what to do in the certification space in general. So I appreciate this question. I'll speak to a little bit of what I've heard brands speak to when they've attempted to pursue these certifications, is that especially in the herbal space with lots of farms being really small, certifications can be expensive. That's something that I mentioned earlier. Of course, they have value in communicating to consumers, but perhaps there's an important consideration whether a brand decides to purchase a certification or not, is to ask, like, what is the paradigm of my aim here? Am I trying to ensure that the producers are meeting my criteria, or have I also learned from them what's possible in their place? And so sometimes pairing certifications with a program where producers are able to say, in addition to these requirements, this is really important to me, can be a useful way to strike that balance. Robbe, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I might add that I purchase mostly organic food. Look for the ROC and regenerative labels where possible, and I do personally notice a difference in taste and quality in organic oranges as opposed to conventional in particular, and so I think they very much have a role to play, and share some of the concerns that you mentioned, Lauren. I'm particularly curious about the burden that can be placed on producers when they're sourcing to multiple entities who are looking for different certifications, and really encourage that deeper relationship with producers around what their needs are and what their challenges are, if they actually experience a benefit from a given program, or if it's solely a market incentive. And then it kind of goes back out to the market education piece around what programs and what processes bring about the best or highest levels of impact in a given context. Would the exact requirements of a given certification on a 1,000-acre farm in North America be applicable to a 1-acre farm in Ecuador? I'm not sure if those requirements are held as the same, and so don't have a clear answer of yes or no. I do believe there's a strong role to be played with these systems, but that it's really a contextual and case by case basis.
Robbe's reflection just made me think of something else along the lines of collaboration and like next steps in the industry, is that along the lines of data burden that brands have been considerate of is whether a brand is pursuing a third-party certification or a desire to meet an internal standard, the amount of information that's being shared between suppliers and brands is increasing. And even though those insights are really, really important, there is a difficult transition that suppliers are facing in that process. If the same farm or cooperative is selling to 7 different brands and they're all being asked the same question in 7 different formats, it can be really difficult to communicate what they're doing, even if what they're doing is exactly in line with what the brands need. And so we've heard some cool initiatives amongst brands that are starting to ask questions of, how do we have a shared data request? We all have the same supplier. Let's ask them the same questions. And in doing so, it's another collaborative approach to make this process of generating insights a little bit easier for producers on the ground and the suppliers in between, and helping brands meet the need that they're facing to have additional insights.
I just want to give a plug for some work a Sustainable Herbs program is doing, the Scope 3 working group, where that's exactly, the company, there's 7 brands that are collaborating and they need to measure their Scope 3 emissions, and they share similar suppliers. And so one of the key things is not just getting the mapping information, but how to reduce the burden on the suppliers by sending one data request rather than 7. So it has its challenges, but yeah. So I want to give you all a chance. There are other questions. We're not going to get to them. I want to give you all a chance to talk about what next for you. What are you most excited about, that you believe can have the biggest impact? The world is overwhelming right now. So what fires you up?
Yeah, I'm personally, and Lauren, you touched on this, the opportunity for collaborative sourcing across industries really strikes me as speaking of a nodal approach toward scaling deep, as you mentioned. Kind of love that term there. There's so much discussion around kind of the footprint, land use footprint of given crops, but what happens when you're growing 20 crops on one footprint, so to speak, and the potential quote unquote reduction of harm, but actually the benefits of that complexity that can arise, and also the nutritional and quality benefits that arise in those crops when they're grown in synchronicity with one another. And I'm also really excited to continue the process of bringing farmer stories and uplifting farmer stories in the process, via processes with brand partners around creating films, and really uplifting the voices of key farm leaders.
Nice. Lauren, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm excited for some upcoming opportunities we have to continue to learn from our farmers, especially in the space of merging markets. As Robbe started to speak to, there's different demands that are happening across the industry, and it'll be interesting to see how brands respond to those demands. The EUDR, the deforestation regulation, for example, is a really interesting moment where brands are continuing to face challenges of having an understanding of what their impact is. And through that, there's, as the thread underlying so much of our conversation today, is the opportunity to build relationship. So up next for us is just continuing to uplift the paradigm in which that engagement takes place through. There are a lot of amazing agricultural production systems out there that we're excited to be engaged in, and ensuring that the relationships between those places and the people that are stewarding them continue to be prioritized as we grapple with some changes in the industry. And I think it's a really valuable opportunity to continue to emphasize the leadership that farmers have in this space.
Just as you said that, it clicked the hour, 3 p.m. Eastern time, and that seems a nice place to end with the farmers and their voice. Thank you all so much for joining. I don't know if you have a second, you were going to drop in the chat a few links for next steps or how those involved can get involved, or you can send those to me later and I'll send that in the follow-up email with the recording.
Yeah, and if it's okay, we'll send it to you because I'm only seeing an option to post to the panelists.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much, and thank everyone for joining. It was great to see so many of you here, even when we're all inundated with webinars. So thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks for everyone joining.
Thank you.